Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar, The Many Facets of a Career as a Professor, with our host, Rob Fairlie. My name is Cassie Petoskey, and I'm the Assistant Director for Career Advancement for your Northwestern Alumni Association. We'll begin shortly, and we're so excited that you're joining us for today's presentation. But first, I'd like to take you through the platform so you know how to use the webinar platform you're on today. So if you have any feedback or comments, please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will use that to engage with everyone throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions specifically for Rob, please send those in through the Q&A tab. We are saving plenty of time at the end of the presentation to ask Rob all of these questions, so you can send them in now as well as throughout the presentation. Should you experience any technical issues during the presentation, you can email the Big Marker support team for further assistance at support@bigmarker.com. Lastly, a link to access the recording of the webinar will be sent to all registrants later today. Now let's move on to why we're all here. Rob Fairlie is Professor of Economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a Research Associate, NBER. His research interests include entrepreneurship, education, information technology, inequality, labor and economics, and immigration. Within entrepreneurship, he is currently working on research projects on job creation among entrepreneurs and the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to blocked opportunities for entrepreneurial success. He received his PhD and MA from Northwestern University and BA with honors from Stanford University. He has held visiting positions at Stanford, Yale, UC Berkeley, and Australian National University. He has received funding for his research from numerous government agencies and foundations. He has testified to the U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, and U.S. Department of Treasury and the California State Assembly regarding the findings from his research, and received a joint resolution from the California legislature. I'm going to hand it over, and thank you so much for being here, Rob.
Thank you. This is great. That was such a wonderful introduction. That's actually going to make it a little bit shorter what I have to talk about. But yeah, it's great to be here. It's great to talk to other Wildcats. It's really nice to kind of give back to Northwestern, where I had just such an incredible experience, my 5 years getting a PhD there. So I just wanted to talk a bit about what it's like to be a professor and all the different activities that you do. I think a lot of people think of professors as just doing research and maybe teaching classes, but there's just so much more that goes on. And so that's sort of like what I wanted to talk about. And then, of course, leave a lot of room for questions, because I'm sure many of you do have questions about it. So my background, as Cassie mentioned, I did my undergraduate degree at Stanford in economics. And then I worked actually for 2 years as a research assistant at a firm called Lewin ICF in San Francisco. And there we did kind of healthcare consulting work. Part of the reason I did that is I wasn't sure if I wanted to go on to get an MBA or if I wanted to go on to get a PhD in economics. And working as a research assistant for 2 years was very, very important for me, because it just sort of solidified my kind of desire to do kind of more sort of quantitative research, which meant to not go the MBA route and go into getting a PhD. And by working there, I had worked with people who had PhDs and people who had MBAs, and it was just kind of interesting talking to them. So that was one of the things that I think was very, very important for me in terms of my career, is just those 2 years after I received my BA and before I went to get my PhD. So then for my PhD, I decided to leave California, which is where I grew up, and try out the Midwest. And of course, the cold shock of the first winter was pretty intense, but I got used to it pretty quickly. And Northwestern was just such an incredible place, and there was so much going on, and just kind of the intellectual activity was amazing. And then, of course, being in graduate school was also just a really wonderful experience. So at Northwestern, then, I received a master's degree. But in honesty, the master's degree is just something that they give you as you work on your PhD. So it's not really anything separate. It can be. You can definitely go to schools and get a master's degree, and that's very common. Some individuals will go get a master's degree somewhere else other than their undergraduate institution, then apply to PhD programs after getting the master's degree. Whereas I did not do that. I went straight into the PhD program and received that. So that's something we can talk about in the question and answer period. If you are trying to kind of debate whether or not to get an MA or a PhD, right away, that's kind of an important decision also, and another different kind of route along the way. And so then I got hired as a professor, assistant professor of economics at University of California, Santa Cruz. I don't know if you've been to Santa Cruz. It's a very, very beautiful place in the redwood forest, and we're very close to the ocean. And so I've been there my entire career. It's worked out really well. I, really believe strongly in what the University of California system does in its educational mission and its research mission. And it's just been a great place to be. But I've also, along the way, I've had several visiting positions. So last year I was actually a visiting professor at Stanford, which was kind of nice to go back and kind of reconnect with the university, even though it's only, about an hour's drive away. And for one semester I was at Yale University, which was really great, just kind of being on the East Coast and trying that out for a while. And then another time for a year I was at UC Berkeley, which is about an hour and a half drive from Santa Cruz. And that was also kind of a nice experience, different group of people, bigger campus within the UC system, but also a lot of similarities between, what Berkeley has going on in their campus and what Santa Cruz has going on. And then the biggest difference experience was going to Australia National University for 2 months. And I did that in our winter, their summer. So it was quite interesting to leave when it was reasonably cold here in Northern California and to go into, several days where it was 90 to 100 degrees in kind of the desert in Australia, in Canberra. So anyway, but that was also a great experience. And that's one of the kind of first things I'll mention that's wonderful as a professor is there are lots of opportunities for being a visitor. There are lots of opportunities to leave your campus and go somewhere else for anywhere from a couple of weeks to an entire year. And that's I think one of the greatest ways to meet new people, to get excited about your research, to work with collaborators, to just kind of broaden what you think about and your kind of ideas and research part of it. There also, I did not do this, but some professors will go to other universities and teach. And that's kind of another way to augment your salary or extend your leave and use less of your sabbatical credit. And that can be very valuable too. I was just worried about doing this because I really wanted to focus on my research and not be too committed in terms of teaching at another university, which is also a fair amount of work because you have to prepare a new course in some cases. So that's another thing that we can talk about in the Q&A, but it is definitely one of the real kind of exciting parts of the job. Okay, now the actual specific parts of a job, and I'm going to be very focused on kind of life as a research professor, or more specifically, a professor at a research university. It's very different if you're a professor at maybe a liberal arts school or a community college or a place where your focus is much more on teaching. Okay, so I'm talking about those universities, and there are of course many of them in the US and around the world that have a very strong research component. So all of the University of California campuses, of course, do this. This is like the primary mission of the University of California. And it's different than our California Community College system's mission. And the California State College system is somewhat in between the two, but it also has an emphasis on research, just a little bit less. And there's more kind of emphasis on the teaching part. So again, that's something that we can talk about in the question and answer period, because there are some important distinctions there. And if you're considering a career as a professor, it is important to think about that and what you want to do. Okay, so I am going to focus on sort of R1 universities and what that part of the job is like. Okay, so the first part is research is the most important. Okay, so the saying that publish or perish is definitely true. That's going to be the first and foremost part of the job that you have to worry about. It's going to be the one that comes up in your merit evaluations the most. It's going to be the most important for how you're viewed outside of your university, like in the broader profession. Okay, teaching is also extremely important, and I'll talk about that. And I think that the idea that you're teaching classes and that's the only part of teaching is not true at all. There's much more involved. There's much more subtlety in what you do in the teaching component. And then finally, service is something that people don't often think about, but there's also a very, very strong service component at universities. Universities are not entirely run by administrative staff. The faculty actually have to do a lot of the service part of it. And so I will go through that in some detail also. Okay, to start with research, that's the most important. Another saying is publish, publish, publish. And that's definitely true. That's going to be, as I mentioned, the most important part of the job. It's the most important thing that you get evaluated on. To give you some sense of my background, I'm an economist. I'm very interested in topics that are around entrepreneurship. So new businesses, startups, being close to Silicon Valley also is kind of interesting because it's certainly a part of, what has motivated me to think more about, new business creation and entrepreneurs. I'm also very interested in education. I've done a lot of work with community colleges, for example, and a lot of issues about inequality in education. Labor is another important area for me because I actually was trained as a labor economist at Northwestern. And we had one of the best groups in labor economics in the world at the time that I was a graduate student there. So it was just incredible training. The late Dale Mortensen was there. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and he was one of the professors at Northwestern who was a labor economist that I took classes with. So that was, really amazing kind of training and background information. I'm also very interested in information technology. So the use of computers, internet, and other forms of technology, especially in education. There's sort of a lot of changes that have happened over time in that area. And it's a really interesting area because there's always something new, right? There's always a new technology that's out there that schools are trying to use, that parents are trying to use for their kids. And it's certainly not a static research area by any means. And then just in general, I'm very interested in public policy issues. There's sort of broader issues about how we create either government policies or even private policies to either help people or to solve kind of social problems. So just some recent topics. I'm doing research on many, many different topics right now, and you can look at my webpage to see, what I'm working on and some of the working papers and some of the publications I have. But some of the big topics right now is I'm very interested right now in thinking about job creation among startups. So that's one. And then college affordability, trying to get a sense of, who can afford to go to college and how that's affected, kind of long-term enrollment patterns in four-year colleges and also two-year colleges. And then I'm really interested in transfer rates among community college students. Specifically, I'm very interested in why it is that underrepresented minority students are much less likely to attend a community college and transfer to a four-year college, such as the University of California campus or a Cal State campus. And then recently, I've been doing some work in a very different area for me on water conservation. So anyway, those are just some of the current topics. I've studied a lot of other topics. And of course, if you're really interested in that, you can check out my webpage. What is my methodological approach? That's actually very important to me. I'm an economist, but I'm also a quantitative economist. So I do a lot of work in econometrics and statistics. I work with random experiments, which are these kind of bigger projects that often take, 3, 4, even 5 years to do. But they're also very powerful, and they're very interesting in the sense that they kind of mimic the idea of medical research in terms of experiments. And then finally, big data seems to be kind of the kind of catchy word that everyone's using. But I do work with massive data sets that often will have 10 million, 20 million, in some cases, 100 million observations in them. And, it requires some fast computing power. But that's kind of the area that I'm interested in. So kind of the bottom line is I'm, a nerd, right? I'm really interested in this quantitative part of it. But as I sort of view it as that the quantitative work that I do is extremely valuable in terms of solving these kind of bigger, broader social problems, as I mentioned in the recent topics that I'm studying. Okay, so back to the job as a professor and less focused on myself. The number one requirement, as I mentioned before, for tenure, for promotions is publishing. And there's always this kind of trade-off between quality versus quantity. And it really kind of depends on the field that you're in in economics, there's much more focus on quality. And what I mean by is quality is the journals generally have a very clear ranking. And the idea is that you really want to focus on publishing in the very top journals in your field. Okay, so the fact that you have this trade-off between publishing, say, anywhere to 6 to 10 publications in high-quality journals versus publishing maybe 10 to 20 publications in lower quality journals, there's certainly going to be an emphasis on the first, right, on having the quality. And that is something that's really important kind of along the line in terms of, individual's career. And, again, we can talk about that more if you guys have specific questions about it. Now, also what's changing is it used to be very focused on the publications, but now there's a lot more kind of metrics out there. So there are rankings in different fields. Google Scholar is one of the ones that's really taken off, and Web of Science is kind of an older one that's related. But now with Google Scholar, so if you look at this page, this is what it would look like for a profile for a professor, is it would show you a number of different metrics that are important. One is it lists all of your publications. So this is just a screen snapshot of the first page of my Google Scholar page. And it just shows the first 5 publications. And they're the publications with the most citations that I have. They show you the year. And then what's really interesting on the right-hand side is it shows you some of the metrics that departments are now using for evaluations, and especially deans are looking at and thinking about. And it shows you kind of your trends over time in terms of how many citations you get. But this is also very important because it's possible that you could publish in the very best journals in your field, but not have anyone look at them. And so this sort of validates that in the sense that if you're getting, 100 citations or, some real superstar articles will get 10,000 citations, that shows you that others are really using that work and it's very valuable, and it has the keyword that people use a lot is impact. Okay, so then publishing, it depends on the field, but certainly in economics and most of the social sciences at least, journal articles are the key, that you're trying to publish in certain journals. You're trying to publish in the highest ranked ones. Also, books are something that people write. Books take a very long amount of time. I've written one that took me about 5 years to work on. I wouldn't say it was 5 years of steady work, but it was over a 5-year period at which there were definitely months where I worked full-time or more than full-time on, trying to finish up the book. But the end, then you have something that's very tangible. Books are often read by a broader audience than journal articles, and they can be very valuable for your career. And some fields, that actually is the key, is being able to write a book is sort of the criteria for getting tenure, and then maybe having 1 or 2 other journal articles. Chapters for edited volumes is another kind of popular thing to publish in. Those are typically books that have a bunch of different chapters that are related to each other, but they're written by different authors. And that's kind of the key. That's what makes them different than a book. Reports, policy briefs, op-eds, and regular columns. Those are all other ways that professors work on their research or disseminate their research. Typically, those 3 activities, though, are not counted as much in terms of your promotion or your standing in the field, but they still, provide impact. Grants are another really important part of the job. In some fields, grants are necessary to do your research. So if you're doing experiments and you're working in certain countries where you have to have the money to hire people to help you with that research, then you need the grants to be able to do that. One interesting fact about it is that universities love it when faculty members bring in grants, especially from the NSF or NIH, and that's because overhead goes to the university. So you have to build in overhead, and in some cases, this is over 50% of the grant goes directly to the university. So it's a way that universities fundraise, right? They fundraise through tuition, they fundraise through donors, but the third way they fundraise, or the third of the main way they fundraise, is through overhead on grants. And so it's very important for them, and it's highly encouraged for faculty to do this. There are also contracts that you can receive. So often if you work with the government, so I've done a lot of work with the Department of Labor and the U.S. Small Business Administration, they do not provide grants, and instead they provide contracts directly to researchers. Okay, let's talk about teaching then. So I mentioned up here, it's not just about lecturing in front of class, but that is a big part of it. So often you teach undergraduate classes, you teach master's classes, PhD level, and you can imagine they're very different. Undergraduate classes, some of them can have 500 students in them if you're teaching introductory material, especially in a popular major like economics. Master's, typically it's around 40 to 50 students that you're teaching, and then PhD can be as little as 5 students if it's an advanced PhD elective course, or maybe 10 to say 30 if it's one of the more kind of basic, core classes. So there's that trade-off between large lectures, small classes, and it depends on the program, but it also can be specific to the class you're teaching. So for example, I've been teaching an undergraduate honors type class for several years, and I'm only teaching about 15 to 20 students in that class. So it's a nice small class, but it is at the undergraduate level. Okay, then another big part of the job is working with graduate students. So especially at large public universities, a lot of the help that is provided for these class sizes with 500 students is through graduate student teaching assistants. And that's a key part of the job, is supervising those students, helping them, training them, writing up problem sets, working on solutions with them. It's a major, major part of the job that's kind of often overlooked, but it's also an important one. Now, what's really interesting is kind of at the most elite research universities, there used to be this old saying that good evaluations meant no tenure. Obviously it was a bit sarcastic, but it was also partly true. Is there was this kind of idea that if you were spending a lot of time working on your teaching, that wasn't a good thing. That is not true at all now. And I think what's really changed is that, when you think about undergraduate education, is that it's very expensive, especially at private universities, and most public universities have also seen increases in tuition that have been faster than inflation. And so students are now demanding, and their parents are demanding, high quality education. And I think that the administrators of universities have really listened to that. And so now there's much more of an emphasis on, being a very good teacher and putting the time and effort into teaching those classes. And of course, that's very refreshing, right? It is an important part of it, and it should be an important part. Advising is another key component of the teaching. So PhD, you serve on PhD committees, you serve on field studies for students, and that could be at the undergraduate level or the master's or even PhD level. Honors theses for undergraduates is another kind of important component. Master's theses, another one. So there is a lot of advising, and that advising can be at all levels, PhD, master's, undergraduate, and it's another very important part of the job. And in some cases, if you have 3 or 4 PhD students and say they're going on the job market that year, that is a huge amount of your time. In many cases, it can be just as much time as teaching a regular class. Finally, there's writing, hiring, and working with graduate students on research projects. That's all kind of related. That's another form of teaching. It's more of a supervisor. It's more of a kind of an advisory role, but it also is time consuming. Professors, of course, don't think about it as much as the teaching part because it is part of their research. So it's sort of a combination of the two, but it is definitely a big component of the job. Service is kind of the third part of the job that's not talked about as much. And if you were, for example, at a cocktail party and you were talking to someone and you said you were a professor, no one would even think of this as a key component of the job. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of self-governance in terms of how universities are run, and professors play a key role in that. So at the department level, one of the most important services that you can do is chair. I was the chair of my department for 3 years, and it was an enormous amount of work. It was just day-to-day kind of issues that came up that could come up with undergraduate, master's, PhD students, There's discussions with the Dean of Social Sciences constantly. There are discussions with the Chancellor of the university or the Vice Chancellor of the university about different programs, about what's happening in economics. You're involved in all of the merit reviews for every faculty member, every lecturer. So it's a very, very demanding job. In a lot of departments, it's a 3-year rotation. So the idea is that it should be shared by all the faculty and that you have a 3-year term and then it gets rotated to someone else. So it's sort of like sharing the work that's involved in it. There's also some other interesting committees. Most departments will have an undergraduate teaching committee, and that committee is in charge of all undergraduate education. They'll have a master's committee. They're in charge of the master's program and the education going on there and student issues that come up. PhD committee. There are also a lot of recruiting committees. So for example, our department right now is hiring 2 faculty members, 2 junior faculty members. And so people will serve on the recruiting committees, and that means going through, we will easily get 500 applications for every job we post, and going through all those applications, coming down with an initial list of say around 25 to 30 faculty that we're more serious about, and then making some very difficult decisions and flying out typically around 5 job candidates for each position. So the recruiting committees, it's a huge amount of service and a lot of time involved. There are also lots of other kind of smaller committees. There's also service for the division. So every department's going to be in a division. So economics is in the social science division. The other departments in social sciences are typically sociology, psychology, sometimes education, anthropology, politics or political science is another one that's often in a social science division. And so at the division level, there are lots of different committees. And what they do is they bring together faculty from different departments to talk about issues that are related to something broader about social sciences. So we are going to start up a social science policy program in the near future, and that would be an important committee that people would do on the division level, because it wouldn't just be one department, it would be several. University has other types of committees that are very important. So for example, I served on the graduate education committee, and so that committee did work that was related to all graduate programs on campus. So we would evaluate files, for example, from engineering, or we might evaluate files that were coming in from arts, right, where we have very little knowledge about the research that's being done, but we would be these independent evaluators in terms of the graduate programs they were running and making sure that they worked and that they were, that they were providing a good service to the students. And also just having some kind of university continuity across programs was very useful. University systems, another interesting one. So public universities typically are part of a system. So the University of California is a great example of this. It's a very, very large system. So we have, UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC Santa Cruz, UC Santa Barbara, UC Davis. They're all part of this large system. And there is also service work that's involved in working in that system. And that usually involves meeting at different campuses, and that usually requires a lot of work. And that's something that, very few faculty do. Usually they're much more senior and they have more time to be able to travel across campuses. Professional service, I'll mention some more specific ideas here, but there's also service to the profession. You're not just working for your university, but typically you belong to an association. So for example, I belong to the American Economic Association, and sometimes you'll do work that's service work specifically for that association. Now, if you wanted to take service to the next level, there are lots of administrative appointments. So one of the most common ones is being a dean, and you would be a dean of division. So in my case, it would be the dean of social sciences. There are provosts. In my campus, provosts are actually part of the college system. So they work with where the undergraduates live on campus, and they run programs that are related to that. And they have to work on all the housing issues that our undergraduate population deals with. Then if you get to the very, very high levels, obviously there's a vice chancellor or vice president, and then the chancellor, the president of the universities. And those are very, very demanding jobs, and of course, very prestigious jobs. But there are also many other positions that are service related that that are above what I was mentioning, where faculty serve on committees. But these are actually administrative jobs that you then switch over your salary from being a faculty member to being an administrator. And then what often happens is when a professor is done with being, say, the vice chancellor or provost, they will switch back to their department and become a regular faculty again. And that's actually pretty common. You know, in a lot of these positions, they kind of encourage people to work on them for, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and then the position gets rotated to someone else. Okay, other parts of the job that are important, depending on the field, but certainly in my field, I've done a lot of government testimony. So I've testified in front of Congress. I've testified in front of the California State Senate and Assembly. And that's a really exciting part of the job. It's one of the most exciting part of the jobs, in my opinion, where you're talking about your research findings, and how they can have a much broader impact on policy or on something that's a pressing concern for either Congress or the federal government in some other agency. Government consulting is also another really interesting area of the job, is that often, depending on the research you're doing, there are a lot of government agencies that really kind of need help in figuring out problems. And they'll ask professors, you know, faculty members, to help them solve those issues, or at least discuss them, or maybe summarize the research that's been done on it. Private consulting also can be a very rewarding experience. I've done a lot of work working on minority business programs and trying to help cities and counties and other local government agencies try to figure out how they can create programs that can help contractors, underrepresented minority contractors, get a foothold in the market and avoid, you know, discriminatory policies. And that can be really exciting and rewarding work also. There are also research affiliations. So for many years, I was a research affiliate with the RAND Corporation down in Santa Monica and worked on research projects with them. And that was kind of a nice setup, because I could work on projects they were working on as kind of an independent researcher, you know, as a separate. So I would just maintain my position at University of California and then be able to work on those projects. There are many advisory boards that faculty serve on, and those can range in the private to sort of nonprofit world. Referee service is a huge part of the job that's often overlooked. And that is that every journal article I submit, or potential journal article that I submit, there will be anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 referees that review that paper and provide comments to an editor. Well, on the flip side, that means that for every paper someone else sends, I have to be refereeing many of those papers. And depending on what area of research you do and how far along you are in your career, there are some weeks where I'll get 5 or 6 requests for refereeing a paper in 1 week. And there's absolutely no way that I can take on that much, because, you know, it's a huge commitment of time to read a paper very carefully and provide comments to an editor. And so that's something that you have to sort of make judgments about how many you're going to take, how often you're going to take them, and really try to balance a reasonable amount of service on that. Book reviews are similar. You're reviewing a book instead of a journal article. Grant proposals, you also review those. And then there's just kind of main editorial service. So you serve as an editor. Right now I'm serving as a special editor on a journal. That's also a lot of work, because you have to go through each paper that's submitted and look at them carefully and provide comments and make very difficult decisions about rejecting or accepting papers. And often what happens is, if you're an editor of a journal, you know many of the people who are submitting the papers. And so in some cases, you're rejecting papers from colleagues of yours or people that you know very well and have known them for many years. And it's a very awkward situation, but it's also an important one. And kind of in the end, everyone understands the process because they're on sort of both sides of it. Seminar presentations, one of the most exciting parts of the job, I think, is you travel around, you get invited to give seminars on your research. That's also very important for kind of two main reasons. One is it really forces you to think carefully about the research you're doing and gives you comments on the research you're doing. Second is that you're meeting a lot of people when you give a seminar. So for example, I gave a seminar at the University of Texas in Austin in the fall. And as part of that seminar, I met with 10 different faculty members from the University of Texas. I would say half of those faculty I knew really well from other conferences and from previous interactions in my career. But about half of those faculty that I met that day, I did not know. And so it's really great for making connections and talking to new people. Okay, so the bottom line here is if you're considering a PhD career as a professor, the first thing you got to know is that the job market is extremely competitive. So for example, I looked up Northwestern, the current faculty in economics. There are 40 economists, and I went through most of them, and many of them have been there for over 20 years. So you can imagine there just aren't that many jobs. Economics is one of the biggest fields of all fields at universities. So you can imagine that in other fields, there are even fewer. And so that's kind of the first thing to keep in mind is it's competitive. There are a lot of people that want to be professors at research universities, and it's difficult, to get those jobs. There's also a big difference between quantitative fields and qualitative fields. The quantitative fields have been growing pretty rapidly over time, and so that's good if you're interested in economics or engineering or kind of math-related fields. The qualitative fields have seen some kind of pulling back, and so it's a little bit harder in those fields because there aren't as many undergraduates, that are really interested in doing those types of fields because they're worried about getting jobs. And so that's also kind of translated into fewer opportunities at the PhD level and faculty level. Another thing I would be, kind of warn you is be careful about acquiring too much debt. Usually when you get a PhD, you're looking for teaching assistant positions, researcher positions, fellowships that can pay for most or even all of the tuition because, you don't want to be in a situation where maybe you have debt from being an undergraduate and then you're adding on top of that debt from being a PhD student. You just want to kind of keep that to a minimum. And that's something to be really careful about. Then finally, I would say I would only take this route if you're really passionate about your field, the topics, the research, and the teaching. You really want to make sure that you're really excited about those 4 areas. Because if you're not, it's a very hard, long road. And you have to be really interested and passionate about what you're trying to study, okay, and teach. And that's something that I've never had to worry about. I've always been really, really interested, especially in kind of this intersection between economics and public policy. But finally, one thing I didn't realize as much is you've got to have the determination and patience to publish because it does take a lot of extra work just to get the research that you've done published in those journals that then give you the promotions that you need to get tenure and to kind of move on your job. But I will say it is truly an amazing job. I really love it. And, there's not a day when I come in where I'm not excited to kind of come in and work on something because there's just so much, kind of like exciting stuff to work on in terms of research and teaching and everything else that's involved. So finally, if you want some more information, definitely go to my webpage that Cassie has linked or email me directly. I certainly will love to talk to other former Wildcats. And I guess we're open for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob, for sharing all of this really great information and taking us through this presentation. We do have plenty of questions to get started, and I will continue to encourage people who are on the webinar today to send in any questions you may have for Rob, even if you think they may be specific for you. So Rob, to start out, Kelsey is writing in, how do you think about the balance between teaching and research? How do you negotiate with the institution you're working with to achieve the balance you prefer?
Yeah, that's a great question. The balance is often determined by the university. So for example, at University of California, we have what I would say is a relatively light teaching load. Our normal load would be 4 classes a year on the quarter system. And so we typically would have a quarter where we're not teaching and we can just focus on research. And so that is sort of, it's a difficult thing to negotiate about because it's usually part of the institution. Okay. And you can try to get grants to buy out more teaching, or you can try to negotiate for at least the first few years when you're coming up for tenure to try to get some more course reductions. But ultimately, you're going to be teaching the level of teaching that university has set up. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind. And I guess the thing is that if you're teaching a heavy load, the university knows that, and so that there's a little bit less emphasis on research. So for example, like the California State College system, they are teaching a lot more than we are in the University of California system. And so their requirement for publications is much lower than ours. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's not something you can decide other than the type of university you want to go to, but the universities have kind of this built-in trade-off between the two and what they expect. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, is really look into that carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Kelsey is also wondering, how do you determine the short-term and long-term trajectory of your research agenda? How do you think about switching gears between topics? For example, do you focus on one or multiple topics within a given year?
I think it's very important to focus on multiple topics. And the word that's used a lot is a pipeline. You really have to have a lot of different things in the pipeline. So you always want to have kind of new work that's exploratory that you're working on now that might not get published for 5 years. And then you want to have your intermediate work, which is, close to getting published, or maybe you're giving seminars on it. And then you want to have your work that's almost done, where it's submitted to journals, you're just working on revisions, you're just kind of cleaning it up and getting that final stage done. And it's really nice to have those three things at all times. And to be able to do that, usually you're going to have to work on multiple topics. It's going to be very difficult to have things in a long-term perspective where you're just working on one topic.
That's really interesting. And how much do you focus on each of those levels throughout, a given year?
Yeah, that kind of depends. I mean, that's pretty specific to the field or even the topics that you're working on. Yeah, I can't really, it's hard to answer that. I wouldn't say it's necessarily 50-50. Say there are two fields that you're working on, or two topics. I think it's just kind of like where you are in the different pipeline for each project. Mm-hmm. But I also think that it is kind of refreshing to switch gears a little bit and work on something else. Because what often happens is you work on something you're very, very focused on for a while, but then you get kind of burned out on it. And it's nice to sort of set that project aside for a month or two and then come back to it later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And Andy is writing in, do you have any advice on career opportunities as an adjunct professor, especially with industries, scientific fields, et cetera?
Yeah, there are a lot of options there as an adjunct professor. I think that the entire field of academia is moving more in that direction. So there'll be even more opportunities in the future. So for example, in my department, we teach a lot of business level classes. And so there are lots of opportunities for adjunct professors to teach in accounting, in marketing. And that's partly because economists are not really trained to teach those classes. And so we need to hire professionals in the area to come in and teach them. And the other thing that we're becoming much more flexible about, and it's interesting because the students actually like this, is teaching classes at night. So someone who's working in a profession, they can come and teach, from maybe 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And the students, we were worried about that before, but they seem to really like it.
Yeah, really interesting. And Rob, we have another question from Alexander. What advice do you have for current undergrads who hope to go on to a PhD program and eventually a professorship? What experiences, courses are most useful for this career path, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that the first thing you need to do is talk to a couple of faculty in the department that you're in and that you're interested in doing work in. Get their advice on what types of classes. So for example, in economics, we really encourage undergraduates who want to move on to get a PhD to take a lot of extra math courses, because the math rigor in a PhD program is at such a higher level than it is as an undergrad, that's usually the thing. That's usually the, the stumbling block for a lot of students. And so we typically ask them to take more classes in that area. But that's going to differ a lot from field to field. And so that's why I'm suggesting go to a couple of faculty in the department and talk to them about it. Like, what do they actually want to do? But I also think that one thing that is broader is try to get some independent research experience. Try to reach out to a faculty member and say, hey, can I do an independent study with you where I work on my own research project? Because I think that's very valuable, that kind of experience before you ever get to a PhD program. I've noticed over and over and over, for many years, students will come in and they'll be very good at solving problems for problem sets or working on exams, but they have a much harder time coming up with a new kind of innovative idea for a research project. And doing that as an undergrad where, the cost is relatively small. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. It doesn't really matter. It's a great kind of learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And we have a few questions coming in with people asking about becoming professors without a PhD. I don't know if you have any advice to this end for people with lots of experience but no PhD. Are they limited, or what are the opportunities as a professor?
So a lot of the community colleges will hire, I think the requirement might be that you have to have a master's degree, or maybe it's not just a master's degree, but like a specialized, like a CPA or something like that. You have to have a specific type of certification. I know that in other areas, so for example, in the arts, that's very different than the PhD kind of requirement. So there are definitely some fields where you don't necessarily have to have a PhD, but most research universities in, the hard sciences or the social sciences or engineering, they're going to require that you have a PhD. That's just going to be the most common. That's going to be, the key to being kind of taken seriously for that job.
Yeah, definitely. Really interesting. And Brandon is writing in, perhaps he's on the older end of attendees, but how old is too old to be worth pursuing a PhD in economics or public policy? It seems the opportunity cost of pursuing a PhD makes it difficult to justify as you get older. Do you have any feedback on this?
Yeah, I would say that I would be very careful about, the opportunity cost part of it. So it used to be that PhDs in economics would take 4 or 5 years. And now it seems like the new equilibrium is to be in graduate school for 6 and sometimes even 7 years. And so, that's a long period of time. And so that's something to really think about carefully. Now, on the other side of the opportunity cost equation is that in a lot of cases, when you're working on a PhD, you can work as a teaching assistant. You're not going to get paid well, but you will get paid. And so there is a way to actually live as a graduate student and get some kind of salary from doing it.
Interesting. And is that what you would consider a part-time PhD, or are these people still full-time?
They're full-time, yes.
Interesting. And are there part-time PhDs? Is that recommended? Is that even an option?
It's not really recommended. I've seen cases where individuals have tried to work on a PhD and it just has not gone well. It's too distracting. You really need to be able to focus your energy and effort in terms of writing your dissertation, doing the coursework, and then working as either a research assistant or a teaching assistant. Those things they require a lot of time and a lot of effort. And to be distracted with a job, either a part-time or full-time job that's in your profession, would be very difficult to do at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And you were talking about the opportunity costs and things like debt. Is there a certain level of debt that you would consider is too much to take on with a PhD program that's kind of like widely across the board known that that's just too much debt, or is it just a personal preference thing?
I think it's more of a personal preference. It depends a little bit on the field that you're going to go into. So if you're going to go into engineering, for example, and you get a PhD in engineering, even if you don't get a job as a professor, you're going to have lots of job opportunities, right? There's going to be a lot of firms, in industry and even government type jobs where you're going to be, highly sought after. And so then maybe you're more willing to take on a little more debt. Sort of similar to people who get an MBA or get a law degree, they're willing to take on more debt because they know the job prospects are pretty good when they get out. But if you're trying to get a PhD in a field, say like anthropology or arts, then it's harder, right? You just don't know. There aren't going to be as many other opportunities in government work or in private industry. So then you'd really want to be much more careful.
Yeah, that's great advice. And Kelsey is writing in another question asking about tips that you may have for applying to graduate school and considering different programs, if you have any general advice for people who are at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, some of the tips are you really want to highlight, I've read graduate applications for, I guess, about 10 years on both of our programs, master's program and our PhD program. And in the personal essay, I think it's really important to sort of talk about why you're doing this. Why are you trying to go to graduate school? What is your goal? That's really important. So that's one thing that's useful. Certainly as an undergraduate, you want to get, great grades and take challenging courses because that will definitely be looked at. And then another thing is the GRE scores are very important. So often we will kind of screen on that and we'll be looking for, in my program, we're looking for students who have very high math GRE scores. So I would put some effort into that. I would definitely study for it, maybe take some of those online classes to prep for it, certainly get some practice books and work on that.
Yeah, that's great advice. And Rob, you talked at the beginning a little bit about how you went and got your MA and PhD at the same time, but it may be different for other people. Can you talk a little bit more about why you personally got both at the same time and why this may be different for others?
Yeah, so there's sort of like two routes. One is you get your bachelor's degree, your undergraduate, and then you get a master's degree that's separate. And so, for some individuals, they'll stay at the university they're at. So for example, we have a 5-year program where you get a BA and a master's. Actually, it's a master's in science, an MS in economics. And then you apply separately to a PhD program. Whereas what I did is also kind of a common route, and that is that you're not getting a master's degree separately. And as you work towards your PhD, you can apply and get a master's degree. And so for me, it's something I don't even usually list on anything that I'm, talking about because I don't see it as separate. I see it as I got the master's degree as I worked on my PhD. But it is becoming more common now for students to go and get a master's degree. And the reason that it could be very valuable is if you're still not sure that you want to go on to get a PhD, is one reason. Another reason is that students will often use it as kind of a proving ground. So say in their undergraduate education, they apply to a PhD program or a set of PhD programs, and they don't get into the level of school they want to get into. What they can do then is go and get a master's degree somewhere and work really hard and get great grades in that and then apply, and it can improve their application. And then maybe they can get into a higher ranked PhD program because of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if you want to get a PhD, would it be considered potentially riskier to do an MA and then apply for a PhD, not knowing if you'd get in, or is that not a consideration?
No, it's not really riskier. It's just another year, and it can be very expensive. It's more like the opportunity cost. It's certainly valuable. Working on a master's degree before you get a PhD exposes you to more graduate work, to more training. It's really just, that extra year. Whether or not it's worth it, I don't know. And then, of course, if you're going to move somewhere else, then you might have to move again.
Right. That's really interesting. And we have another question from Phoebe writing in, asking or saying there are a growing number of interdisciplinary PhD programs. Some professors caution against going the interdisciplinary route since faculty in specific fields may not feel ownership over those graduates. Do you have thoughts on this or advice for those who are interested in pursuing an interdisciplinary degree?
Yeah, this is a really kind of important question. It's interesting because universities really emphasize this interdisciplinary training. And I think that it can be very valuable. But then on the flip side, a lot of departments really want you to be trained in a specific field. They want you to be an economist. So for example, like my area of research really crosses over with public policy and also business too. So for example, I could probably be employed at an economics department like I am, a public policy school, or a business school. And often, you know, professors in those other areas want you to be trained as a specific, you know, economist or sociologist or, you know, person in strategy or person in a specific field. So they're kind of trade-offs to both. I think that if you do the disciplinary training, so you get trained as an economist, you will ultimately be more narrowly focused. And so if you were to apply to a public policy school, for example, as a professor, they could say, well, this person is very narrowly focused as an economist. Or it could be, we want an economist for this job. Let's get an economist and let's not get a public policy PhD. And you just never know, right? There's no way to know for sure which way to go on that. I was actually very fortunate at Northwestern because I was able to get a PhD in economics and do all the traditional work in economics. But at the time I was there was a special NSF funded training program to do interdisciplinary work on public policy and poverty related issues. So I took classes with sociologists. I took classes actually at the University of Chicago even with people in psychology. And it was great because it was more like an add-on to what I had already done. So in a way that worked out really well for me because then I could be an economist, but I wasn't seen as a narrowly trained economist. I was seen as someone who could also do these other fields. Mm-hmm. So I think the key is, you know, to talk to some, you know, undergraduate faculty members that you know, and just sort of see what they recommend and try to figure out what you want to do specifically. If you want to work in an economics department, you definitely want to get a PhD in economics. If you want to work in a public policy school, then you have more options. And that's where it's a little bit trickier to come up with a clean answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. That was great. Hold on one second, Rob. Rob, it's been so great to spend this last hour with you. We'd love to have you share anything else you'd like to add before we end for the day.
Yeah. I mean, if you're really interested in more information, I highly recommend checking out my webpage. I have lots of detail on there, lots of, you know, my publications are there, and also a lot of data sets that I've created and some of the other work that I've done. And then, of course, email me. I'm certainly willing to, you know, talk about kind of further questions that you have, and I'd love to help out.
Awesome. Thank you again, Rob. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. To find all of the archived and upcoming webinars, you can check out our website at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. Have a great rest of your day and go Cats.